Well, welcome. This is the Nishan Chapel in the Greenwood Cemetery. The Greenwood Cemetery was built here in the 1800s. The land for the cemetery was donated by the Greenwood family. The first six plots are down near the road here. And then they moved 10 to 15 graves from the previous grave to the Greenwood Cemetery when it was first erected. As far as the chapel itself, the chapel was built in the late 1930s from local benefactor Frida Myers. She had seen how the winter months and burials really people struggled, and so she wanted the chapel to be a place where people could get out of the elements, pay their respects to their family, and then downstairs you'll get to see kind of how things waited until spring came, until everything was completed. The chapel was built in 1940 by the Freedy brothers, by a construction company which most people have heard of, which is the Freedy brothers. Just to give you some denomination information, the chapel was built with $25,000 back then. We're looking at tuck pointing all of the brick on the exterior. Today's price is right around $90,000 just to put the grout in the stone, to give you a perspective of what maybe it cost in relative terms. And so as of last year, there was a trust fund that governed the cemetery for many, many years, and a cemetery board. As we, big projects such as the roof and then the construction of the roads and such, the cemetery board dissolved and then gave that trust fund to the city of Reedsburg, and we are now under the Public Works Department. It takes about 100 hours a week to keep the cemetery mowed and trimmed. We mow the entire grounds every week and then trim around every single stone and foundation. And so I like to, as director of the Greenwood Cemetery, I like to say it's like the city parks, just a little bit nicer. We do about 3 to 5 funerals where they have a funeral service here and then they'll walk graveside. And we are going on 4 years now where we've had a wedding on Halloween, and so it's becoming a thing. It's a tradition, and so this will be our 5th year that we'll host a wedding on Halloween.
My name's Steve Renkowski. The foundation stones of this chapel and the wing on the east side came from a quarry that's located just below the chapel location, just beyond the chain link fence and the edges of the cemetery border. The decorative stones that make up the chapel walls were cut from a quarry near Richland Center. And the chapel interior is entirely original, having stained wood finishes and numerous stained glass windows, and the lovely pendant light fixtures hanging from the ceiling. The original roof was slate that has been replaced by a metal roof. The roof is an open truss with a spiral resting on the southwest corner. The stone basement, there are 4 stone crypts built in the foundation wall, and they haven't been used for many years, but they were used to keep the caskets during the winter when they couldn't bury people. Now this is kind of an interesting thing here. They had a platform with a hydraulic hoist. They used to be able to hoist the casket up to the chapel when they had the funeral service. And so, as you can see, that's no longer used. So there was a trap door that they got the casket through, and now they reinforced it with a post so nobody falls through.
Welcome to this magnificent Greek Revival stone mausoleum. It's a resting place for several members of the Mackey family. You may be wondering who the Mackeys were. Without them, Reedsburg may never have survived its early beginnings. We, the Mackeys, played a huge role in preventing Reedsburg from becoming a ghost town. Things were looking bleak for the dwindling population of Reedsburg. The year 1852, and the lifeblood of the community, the dam that powered the crucial sawmill and the grist mill, was gone. No more lumber for building purposes could be cut. No more grain could be grown for flour. This was all because David Reed was unhappy. Before Reed arrived in the area, the Willard brothers had been floating logs down the Baraboo River to their sawmill in Baraboo from the government-owned forests around Laval. One of the first things Reed did when he arrived here was to build a dam across the river. The dam was used to power a sawmill and a grist mill, which he also built. A short time after the dam was built, Reed decided to no longer allow the Baraboo logs to pass through. He wanted to prevent the eventual deterioration of his dam and felt the logs backing up above the dam could be bought at a bargain price and wanted to use them himself. The Willard brothers paid a visit to Reed and demanded that their logs be allowed to pass. Reed refused. Tensions mounted between both communities until the resulting conflict was settled when the U.S. Marshal came to town and ordered the removal of the dam. Reedsburg citizens became very angry with the decision, and they considered jailing the marshal. But cooler heads prevailed, and the order was carried out. This became known as the Saw Log War. Perhaps this adventure laid the foundation for the friendly rivalry which has existed between the cities of Reedsburg and Baraboo, particularly in sporting events, to this day. Now, without a dam, the sawmill could no longer cut lumber necessary to build houses for new settlers coming to town. No settlers, no growth. Times were hard and about to get harder. David Reed's dream of building a town was slowly flickering. Heavily in debt and without income from the sawmill, a last-ditch effort was made to revitalize the dam and the mills. A company was formed to sell stock, but the venture failed. The future looked bleak. I, Solomon Mackey, Reed's brother-in-law from Broome, New York, Reed's hometown, was one of Reed's original investors. I was concerned about this investment and was disheartened by the loss of the dam and the failure to revitalize it. But I had an idea that would solve everyone's problems. This included 3 of my sons, Joseph, Safford, and Ebenezer. 2 of my sons went to Reedsburg the next year in 1853. Joseph was 31 and Safford was 22. Joseph also brought his wife Cornelia and their 1-year-old son Frank. Unfortunately, today, our son Joseph could not make it. But I will let you know all about Joseph. In 1854, Joseph brought 2 assets with him, a law degree and $6,000 in cash. He used the money to upgrade and purchase the 2 mills and buy up vacant property. He set up his law office while Safford ran the 2 mills. The following year, our brother, Dr. Ebenezer Mackey, who went by his initials ER, moved to town and set up his medical practice. In 1860, our last brother James and my wife Cynthia and I came to Reedsburg. Joseph was able to acquire prime real estate, which shows on the map as Mackey's first edition, the Mackey edition number 2, and the Mackey edition number 3. The village was laid out and platted in 1852. Now that the mills were producing lumber and flour, new settlers started to come to town, buy land, and build houses. Financial prosperity became permanently restored. People from 20 to 30 miles around came to trade in Reedsburg. One of my primary services was in writing legal titles for the lots I was selling. Since new settlers often needed financing for homes and businesses, a bank became a priority. Along with David and Eli Rudd and James Lusk, we started the Reedsburg Bank in 1867. Since railroads provided vital services to growing towns, bringing the railroad to Reedsburg also became a priority. I was a charter member of the Baraboo Airline Railroad, a group dedicated to bringing the railroad to the area. So on January 1st, 1872, the first train arrived from Chicago. The line eventually stretched to St. Paul and became better known as the 400, based on the distance between Chicago and the Twin Cities, as well as the time it took to make the trip of 400 miles in 400 minutes. Since there was no newspaper in town, Joseph helped start the Reedsburg Herald and served as one of the 3 editors. The paper published from October 1856 to February 1858. The American House was a hotel located on the northeast corner of Webb and Main Streets. Joseph owned the hotel from 1865 to 1873. It was raised in 1928 to make way for the Chevrolet garage.
My name is E.R. Mackey. E stands for Ebenezer by birth. I'm one of 3 sons of Joseph and Cynthia Mackey. My brothers were Joseph and Safford. They were influential in early Reedsburg development and later quite wealthy. David Reed, for whom the city is named, was my father's brother-in-law. With these family connections established, I decided to move here in 1855. I set up a medical practice, but business was slow, so I got involved in the hotel business. My brother and I established the Presbyterian Church along with David Rudd, a local banker. We also built a mansion house on 153 Vine Street. There was a high sandstone outcropping which was blasted away and moved to what is now the Webb Avenue area. There have been several owners of this property. One of them was William Briggs, father of Claire Briggs, the famous cartoonist. In 1860, I moved back to New York.
After I, Safford, got the mills running profitably again, I engaged in some other endeavors. In 1857, I built what is called now the Old Red Barn. This is located at the corner of Pine and Main Street. I used it as a private barn and also as a carriage repair shop, complete with a full forge. This building still stands today. Later, I partnered with Moses Young and started the general merchandise store at 251 East Main Street. I remained in this business from 1866 to 1868. By 1876, the flour mill that I was running was grinding out 600 barrels a week. And finally, in 1878, I was elected mayor of Reedsburg and served a standard 1-year term.
I, Frank Mackey, Joseph and Cornelia's son, went to Reedsburg schools and then Beloit College. And I became an attorney like my father. Well, when you think you can't only go so bad, I proved you could go worse. I started out working in my father's Reedsburg bank as a cashier before moving on to larger banks in Minneapolis and Chicago. By trial and error, or some would say by hook or crook, I amassed a large fortune and used a portion of my money to build this mausoleum in 1912. I was an investor, and my investments took me to many states and foreign countries. I was the founder of HFC, Household Finance Corporation, that some of you may have heard of in the past years, which is still in business today, although under another name. It's now a part of HSBC, which is Hong Kong Singapore Business Consortium. In 1911, I built the Hotel Learnington in Minneapolis for $1 million. I named it after the splendid home I lived in at the resort town of Leamington, Warwickshire, England. The Leamington Hotel became known as the finest hotel in Minneapolis. Presidents Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, Johnson, and Governor Hubert Humphrey all stayed there when in the city. I needed money. I moved to England, and when in London, the monarchy, which desperately needed money, borrowed from me and used the crown jewels as collateral. I loved horses and became one of the best polo players in England. I was an Olympic gold medalist at the Paris Games of 1900, the first time that polo was played in the Olympics. I came back to Reedsburg every year for a week and spent time at my home in the northwest corner of Main and North Locust Streets. I also kept many horses in town so I could ride when I came for a visit. I died on February 24th, 1927. That was 96 years ago. I'm a well-preserved corpse. At that time, I was 87, and I died at my home in Leamington Hotel, Minneapolis. My remains, relatives, and friends were all brought to Reedsburg on a special train, and the funeral services were held from the railroad car conducted by Reverend Wilson of Baraboo. The burial was in this magnificent mausoleum, which I had erected here in Greenwood Cemetery a number of years earlier. 6 men from my Chicago office officiated as pallbearers. After my death, my dear wife Olga Beatrice Layton, an Irish nurse, inherited my fortune and was now one of the richest women in the world. The first family members interred within the mausoleum was my first wife, Florence Mackey, who died in 1912 at age 53. I also provided funds to the Cemetery Association for the mausoleum's upkeep. I paid for the landscaping of the terraced amphitheater in front of the Freedom Myers Nation Chapel. And my father, Joseph, died October 22nd, 1879, at the age of 57. 14 years later, Brother Stafford died of a stroke during a gathering of friends at his house, August 25th, 1893, at the age of 62. They were buried in the lower section of the cemetery. Joseph, my father, was later moved to the mausoleum along with my sister Carrie, who died in 1862 at the age of 4. Stafford's first wife, Harriet, was moved from her original grave and is interred here. My mother, Cornelia's sister, Mary Mackey Finch, was moved here as well. My mother, Cornelia, my other sister, Callie, and her husband, Harry Milne McIntosh, my partner in the Household Financial Corporation, along with their daughter, Marjorie McIntosh Buell, were interred here at the time of their deaths. Marjorie was the last one entombed here when she died in 1983. Over the doorway, you'll be able to see a brief verse from the hymn, Abide With Me. The verse says, "Heaven's morn breaks, but earth's shadows flee." Perhaps this inspired the placement of the stained glass window on the east side of the crypt, where it captures the morning sun and brings color to those resting inside. We invite you before you leave to come up to the front door, take a look through where you will see my bust and that window I just described behind him. Thank you very much for being here today.
Well, welcome everyone. The Civil War was probably one of the most traumatic things that ever happened to the United States. Over 620,000 young men were killed in the war, and it was felt here in Reedsburg. The community was obviously much smaller back then, but we sent a little over 150 young men into the Civil War, and 30 of them never came back. So about 1 in 5 died from Reedsburg in that war. So when they got back, the veterans all over the North formed the Grand Army of the Republic, which was one of the first veterans organizations in the United States. And towards the ends of the 19th century, the technology got better for building monuments. So building Civil War monuments became quite popular. In fact, to the point that there were catalogs where you could order statues and monuments, and I suspect came from one of them. The granite came from a company in Chicago, and this is Vermont granite here. And this was a huge deal back in the 1890s. I can't express how big a deal this really was, because It was one of the first examples of a can-do attitude in Reedsburg, because in 1891, members of the Henry A. Tater Post of the Grand Army of the Republic met, and they thought, well, Reedsburg should have a monument. And less than a year later, on June 4th, 1892, they dedicated this monument. They raised $1,625 to build this, which is the equivalent of over $60,000 today. And Reedsburg was a lot smaller back then. It wasn't a community of 10,000. The 1910 census had 3,000 people in Reedsburg, so I'm guessing it might have been 2,800, if that, back then when this monument was built. And the granite came from Vermont, and it was shaped in Chicago, and I assume it was sent by rail up here. But then this is an 18-ton monument, so they had to use horses and wagons to haul this out to the cemetery from the, I assume, where the depot is today. So you can imagine how much work that was. And then to set the thing this straight and this well, that it still stands straight and tall after 132 years is quite amazing. Now a little bit about the Henry A. Tater Post. Henry Tater was a captain in the 19th Wisconsin Infantry Regiment, and that was where most of Reedsburg's Civil War soldiers served. And Henry Tater left Reedsburg. He died at the age of 33 in 1869 out in Utah. And he thought enough of Reedsburg, and apparently they thought enough of him, that they shipped his body back. And he's actually buried on the other side of that shed over there. So his family came back, but he was like a lot of young men who, I don't know if he was wounded in the war and died of eventual injuries. You just never know. In his regiment, the 19th Wisconsin, 160 men died during the war, 40 of them of combat injuries, and the rest from disease, starvation, dehydration. So it was a pretty brutal time. So the veterans that survived and came back to Reedsburg, and as he mentioned, when you're driving here or walking here, these stars mark graves of Civil War veterans with the flags on them. Now when they fought this war, while slavery was a root cause of the Civil War, the people who fought it was more about preserving the Union. And an inscription on this side says, "And not a star on our flag is dimmed." And the other side has an inscription that says, "Angels have heard your stories, and God knows all your names." Now this monument is 27 feet tall. It's the tallest one in Greenwood Cemetery. And most people probably drive by it and don't notice it. At one time it would have been a lot more noticeable because most of these graves weren't here when it was erected. And at one time there were 2 cannons on each side of it, 17 feet long, were replica cannons from the Civil War. But those were melted down for metal during World War II and never were replaced. And I believe there was a World War I cannon in City Park that met the same fate. And so fortunately the howitzer in Webb Park still is there, so we haven't had any of those super horrible wars since then, though there's certainly been some bad ones. Now if you look up here, there's 2 things on the front here. They're badges. One's for the Grand Army of the Republic, I think that's the lower one, and the other one was for the state of Wisconsin back in 1892. And the soldier on top is at parade rest facing west. He's 6 foot 6 inches tall, which is a lot taller than the average Civil War soldier, who was 5 foot 8, which is about my height. So they built him big. When this was dedicated, it was the event of the year in 1892. It was June 4th. They had a gathering at City Park, which they called the Village or City Square back then. There were speeches and songs, and all sorts of that sort of thing that they did to entertain themselves back then. And then they marched out here to the cemetery for the dedication here. They had a cornet band, a drum corps, and 44 women, each wearing badges representing the 44 states of the Union at the time. And 13 women over 70 years old had special badges honoring the original 13 colonies of the United States. And when they got out here, somehow they covered this. I don't know with what or how they got up there back in 1892, but they did. It was covered in cloth, and 3 young girls, one dressed in red, one dressed in white, and one dressed in blue, pulled off the covers to unveil the monument to the people. And according to the Reedsburg Free Press at the time, they weren't very good at crowd estimating, and I never was in the newspaper business either, but they said there was between 2,000 and 4,000 people here. And the town was less than 3,000, so you can pretty much say almost everyone in town was here for that dedication. And it was a huge thing, and I'm not sure why, this is a little bit of a cannon here. I assume there used to be more of it at one time, but this is what's left of it. And amazingly enough, nobody's stolen it through the years. I suspect it's quite heavy, but this is, this monument stood here for 132 years, and you gotta realize when it was built, I doubt there was much of the city of Reedsburg north of 8th Street, maybe even 6th Street at the time, because households had more people in them at the time than we do now, and the city just wasn't that big.
I, Frank Batiste, was born in 1850 in Cranesville, Erie County, Pennsylvania. On January 22nd, 1850, when I was about 3 years old, I moved to Reedsburg, Sauk County, Wisconsin, with my parents Amos Batiste and Cordelia Nicole. At the time, Reedsburg was just a small village of a few hundred people along the Baraboo River. When I started school, my teacher was Alexander P. Ellenwood, also an early settler in the village. He had come to Reedsburg in 1858 and taught school 1 year in 1859. He became principal of Reedsburg Union School until 1861. He was patriot and felt it was his duty to give his services in life if need to be to his country. He enlisted in the 19th Regiment Company of Wisconsin Infantry as a lieutenant at the beginning of the Civil War and rose to the rank of captain. When he left for war, several of his students went with him, including me. I may have been one of the youngest, if not the youngest enlisted member in the state. The Civil War was a fight to free slaves of Southern plantation owners. It divided the Union and caused the death of 620,000 Americans. President Lincoln raised the call to arms, and men on horseback rode through Reedsburg shouting, "The war has begun." Troops have attacked Sumter. The people in Reedsburg had not grown up with slaves and had the idea that slavery is wrong. No state in the Union was more prompt in sending forward volunteers than Wisconsin, and no part of Wisconsin responded with great vigor than did Sauk County. My father joined the 19th Regiment Company A on January 6, 1862. As a fifer, each company had its own fifer and drummer. I enlisted as a drummer boy the day after the January 7th, 1862. When I was just 11 years old, there were only 300 of us under the age of 15 that had signed up. The minimum age requirement for a combat soldier was 18. On February 22nd, 1862, at age 12, I began my military service with my teacher and father. Each company had its own fifer and drummer. It was our duty to signal the troops what to do and when to do it. To march, halt, charge, retreat, fire, etc. We also regulated the camp duty with a call to dinner, to rise in the morning, and call reveille in the evening. We played during parades, funerals, and for the entertainment of the troops. I was present for every battle we engaged in, from Suffolk, Virginia, and New Bern, North Carolina, to the sieges of Richmond and Petersburg. Richmond, Virginia was the capital of Confederacy. As the war drew to a close, I was present when the 19th Wisconsin Regiment raced into Richmond. The day that city fell and won the distinction of being the first Union regiment whose flag was triumphantly flown over the captured Confederate Capitol building. The rebel capital was evacuated by General Robert E. Lee. My enlistment was up after 3 years as a drummer boy. I could have called it quits and returned home. However, at the age of 14, I re-enlisted as a regular soldier and stayed the course of the war. My father mustered out, having served his 3 years. I returned home safely after the war with my teacher, Captain Ellen Wood. We both mustered out on August 9th, 1865. Our company suffered a total loss of 161 fatalities in this war. Our company was a combination of volunteers from the towns of Reedsburg, Baraboo, Winfield, Woodland, and Westfield. I returned to Reedsburg at the age of 15 and worked for my father in the tailor business at age 20. I learned the miller's trade from my teacher, Captain Ellen Wood. I later became a partner in that business. Teacher Captain Ellen Wood. I married Jane Pomeroy that same year. We had 5 children, 1 son, and 4 daughters. We moved to Camp Douglas, where I was a miller until I retired in 1911 and moved back to Reedsburg. I was a lifelong member of the Grand Army in the Republic, Reedsburg Drum Corps. On August 22nd, 1918, I died of a stroke at age 68 in Boston. I was transported to Reedsburg on the train and met at the station by members of the GAR and the Reedsburg Drum Corps, of which I was a member. They proceeded to Hearst to the home of my cousin, Mrs. Cordelia Pettis Weedman, on 2nd Street, where I had been living for the past 2 years. Since my wife passed away, my funeral was held at her home, and the funeral, conducted by Rev Cook, was one of the Methodist Church and the military rites of the GAR. It was an impressive funeral, and my hearse, preceded by the muffled drums of the Reedsburg Drum Corps, preceded my remains to Greenwood Cemetery, where I was interred near by my captain. A bronze commemorating my grave was placed here.
Hello, my name is David Boyes Rudd. I was born November 4th, 1821 in Beckett, Berkshire County, Massachusetts. I was the oldest of 4 children. We were pioneers who came to Reedsburg in 1851 by way of Willoughby, Ohio. I was now 30 years old. I made my fortune starting with farming in the Reedsburg area. My brother Eli and I formed a partnership called Rudd and Company. We were single men, so we brought our mother and sister with us to keep house for us. So obviously we're men. So the next year, Lieutenant Colonel Strong coaxed my sister to take the position of Mrs. Rollin M. Strong to make good his home instead of ours. This was a terrible blow to us brothers. After that, neither of us never took another maid. And though wealthy and influential, we turned from womankind and lived solely to console each other. In 1855, one of my first projects was the mansion house on the 100 block of Vine Street. Dr. E.R. Mackey was my partner in this venture. Another Rudd & Company's ventures was growing hops. Hops are the flowers of the hop plant used in beer, parts a number of characteristics and flavors. And we did very well growing hops, and our fortune soared. Sensing the demise of the hop market due to the invasion of the hop louse and an overabundance of the crop, we took some of our money and established the Reedsburg Bank in 1867 along with Joseph Mackey and James Lusk. We also bought over 1,400 acres of forest in Monroe County, 50 miles northwest of Reedsburg. We established a sawmill, which grew into a small village called Rudd's Mills, which is located near Warrens, Wisconsin. It had its own post office and railroad station on the 400 tracks. Many Reedsburg residents followed us there, and including my brother Sheldon Rudd, who for 3 years oversaw a crew of loggers getting timbers out for the mill. I managed the overall mill where we cut down the trees, milled the logs, and then sent them to the railroad to be shipped. We did our part, fulfilling the large demand for lumber in this growing part of the state. In 1882, after 14 years, I quit. I was now 61 years old and moved back to Reedsburg. I was one of the first trustees in the village of Reedsburg when it was incorporated in 1868. The first bank we established in 1867 was a private bank by Mackey, Rudd & Company, and it was located at the northwest corner of Main and Locust Street and operated there for 10 years. In 1877, a devastating fire came to the bank, and we reorganized it and moved it to a new location at 233 East Main Street. I lived upstairs in the upper flat. And I became president of the Reedsburg Bank from 1886 to 1896. In 1884, at age 63, I married Mary Myers, age 36. We had no children of our own, but in 1890, Mary's niece, Frida Myers, came to live with us after her parents' marriage disintegrated. Everyone involved felt this would be best for Frida. The three of us enjoyed life, including traveling around the country. In 1886, a few partners and I brought the Reedsburg woolen mills located on the Baraboo River, which had been for sale for a couple of years. Many upgrades were made to the mill, and this business eventually became the largest employer in Reedsburg. The mill was in operation for 81 years until 1967. Mary and I were married for 12 years when I died in 1896 at the age of 74 in Jacksonville, Florida, of a fatal heart attack. Mary was just 48 years old and Frida was 18. My sizable inheritance all went to my beloved wife, Mary Myers Rudd.
Okay. My name is Mary M. Myers Rudd. I was born December 6, 1848 in Janesville, Wisconsin. My father, George Myers, was a cabinet maker. My mother was Louisa Newmeyer Myers. I have an older sister, Louise, and younger sister, Clara. Our sister, Emma, died at age 7 in 1858. Our gravestones are just behind you over there. So there was a need for cabinet makers up north in a new settlement called Reedsburg. So on November 14th, 1855, my father moved our family to Reedsburg. he kept extremely busy in this new endeavor, as there were other people coming to Reedsburg as well for the many opportunities presented. Father eventually opened a furniture store, which worked out very well for us and kept us quite busy. Now, my mother unfortunately got sick and died at only age 43. Such a blow to all of us. But my sisters and I continued to help Father in the store. Eventually, though, my sisters both got married and left. I remained at the store to help my father. He had developed arthritis and needed to retire. I felt my duty to stay with Dad until his death. He died in 1884 at age 76. That was also the year David Rudd proposed to me. He was such a successful businessman, founder of the President's Bank, had his hand in so many pots. I knew I would be all right. We had a happy marriage, enjoyed traveling around the country. In 1890, my sister Clara's marriage dissolved, and her daughter Frida came to live with us. Clara's husband was not a very good man, and it was felt that it would be in Frida's best interest to move with us above the bank. We were visiting Jacksonville, Florida, when David suddenly died at age 74. That year was 1896. I assumed his interest in the Reedsburg Bank, which could have been a very daunting task ahead of me. I had so much to learn. I was fortunate to have attorney Ralph Perry at my side to assist me as my mentor. Now, he took over as president of the bank, but he also helped me to increase my personal wealth vastly. I fully adopted Frida, and we moved to the mansion on Vine Street. Frida and I spent 20 years traveling the world together. I taught Frida about finances, about charitable giving, about always being concerned about your neighbor. I died February 4th, 1924 at the age of 75 while visiting my sister Clara with Frida in California. My body was returned to Reedsburg and laid next to my husband here. So my estate was left to Frida. It was the largest estate ever probated in Sauk County. The estate was over $550,000. In today's terms, any ideas what that would be?
10 mil.
Close, about $9,600,000 today in 2023 dollars. Had Frida not survived me, the estate would have gone to the citizens of Reedsburg in various gifts and trust funds.
My name is Edward Nishan, and I guess my claim to fame is I married Frida Myers. My story goes back a long ways. I was born in Istanbul, Turkey in 1880. I was born in the Armenian section, and it wasn't good for my people. The existing government was very brutal. There was a program called ethnic cleansing. Lots of people disappeared, never to be seen again. We lived in fear. Lots of my people got out, but most of us stayed. It was our home. In 1909, I met my first wife. Her name was Christine Locke, and she was a German, a very brilliant woman, fluent in 8 different languages, was an interpreter for the Allies. Even though she was German, she was an interpreter for the Allies in World War I. But like so many marriages, they don't last. This one went 3 years. That's the bad news. The good news is Christine gave me a wonderful son, Kadif. And I probably should mention my Turkish name was Yervant Garabet Nishian. So I had a son in 1912, Cardiff, but no wife, a single parent. In 1915, I realized that things were getting so bad in Turkey that my boy, Cardiff, and I, like so many others, had to make a decision. We came to America in 1915. So there I was, 35 years old, with a 3-year-old boy. Cardiff and I changed our names. We Americanized them. I became Edward Nishon. He became Charles Nishon. I worked at various jobs for the next 15 years. Charles, who was Cardiff, now Charles, this thrived in school. He had so many good people around him. I was pleased with how clever he was and how he did well in school and the grades he brought home. He was very mechanical, and by the time he's 17 years old, he was involved in the automotive industry, which was really thriving in New York and throughout the country. 1928, I loved the theater. I went to a Broadway play. I just happened to walk down the aisle and there was an empty seat. I sat down. I looked at a woman that was very nicely dressed and started a conversation. I asked her, "Where are you from?" She said, "Reedsburg." I said, "I never heard of it," and we chuckled. We were very compatible at first meeting, and when people traveled, especially those that looked like they had a few dollars, they stayed for a long time, so we developed a relationship. She went back to Reedsburg, we corresponded, she came back to America, or to New York, and it continued. I was 48 years old and Frida was 50. So I swallowed deep, took a deep breath, and I said, "Frida, would you be my wife?" And she said yes. We came back to Reedsburg, married in the Presbyterian Church. Frida lived in a house, the biggest house I'd ever seen, at the corner of Pine Street and 2nd, a big cream brick, 3-story, Second Empire architecture type home. It was really something. We had a wonderful time. We traveled, we did so many things. I kind of kidded her. She was 50 years old. Being 48, I was kidded her that she robbed the cradle, and she kind of chuckled at that. But before 10 years was up, tragedy. My wife Frida had terminal cancer. It didn't take too long for that cancer to take her. I was heartbroken. I never remarried, but I stayed in Reedsburg, and I was going to carry on the legacy that Frida had started, which she will go through. But I realized that Frida was so generous, most generous person I ever met. And I was determined after Frida was gone to carry that legacy on. One of the big things that I did was I gave a great deal of money to the city of Reedsburg, and they used that money to buy 45 acres in the northeast part of town, which is today Nishon Park. I went to Tucson, Arizona, is where I wintered every year, but I came back and I outlived my wife by almost 37 years. In 1975, at 95 years old, it was my time, and I was ready. Nobody ever anticipates living 95 years. I'd seen lots of funerals, lost lots of people. In a 5-year period, when Frida died, I lost a stillborn granddaughter, and my son, Charles, at 31 years of age, was gone also. So at 95, I was ready to join these people. I was ready to go. So my thoughts after I left was, for anybody that's here, is to take care of yourself, take care of others. Good luck. Farewell.
Hello, my name is Frida Myers Nishon. I was born on April 28th, 1878 in New London, Wisconsin. My birth name is Frederic Blanc, a mouthful. My parents are Henry and Clara Blanc. Sadly, my parents' marriage broke up when I was a teen. I moved to Reedsburg in 1890 to live with my Aunt Mary Myers Rudd and her husband David. Aunt Mary was my mother's sister. She married David just 7 years earlier. He was 63, she was 36, and they had no children of their own. David and his brother made a fortune during the hops boom, forming Rudd and Company. Wisely, they saw the end coming and invested some of their money in establishing the Reedsburg Bank. And David was president of the bank for a time. Savvy businessman, Rudd and Company purchased 1,400 acres of prime timberland near Warrens, Wisconsin. They cut the trees. They milled the logs and sent the lumber off from the village David founded, Rudd's Mills. Later, David continued his association with the Reedsburg Bank and again became president. He was also one of the investors in the Reedsburg woolen mills. I was able to travel with Aunt Mary and David throughout the United States, including visiting family in California. Summers were spent in our cottage on Devil's Lake. David died of a heart attack in 1896. He was 74 years old. Aunt Mary continued her involvement with the Reedsburg Bank with the help of attorney Ralph P. Perry, who took over as president. He invested her money and her fortune grew. Mary bought the former home of A.H. Harris on the corner of North Pine and 2nd Streets. We continued to travel, and Aunt Mary, well, she taught me about finances and the importance of volunteer and charity work. Aunt Mary died in 1924. I was 45 years old, and I inherited her entire fortune. It was the largest estate in Sauk County, worth over $550,000. That's over $9 million today. I became a philanthropist, was a faithful member of the Presbyterian Church, and I was generous, constructing a new manse and providing a trust fund for its upkeep. I was a member of the hospital board and bought and donated the land for the new hospital to be built on North Park Street. And I provided as well a fund for its maintenance. At age 50, I married Edward Nishan, who I met in New York City. He was working at the Friars Club. He sat in the empty seat next to me as we attended a Broadway play. Now, Edward was born in Istanbul, Turkey, an Armenian who left Turkey as the Ottoman Empire engaged in its ethnic cleansing. We settled in my house on Pine Street, and we were married just 10 years before I died of cancer on June 1st, 1938. I was 60 years old. My estate had grown to almost $800,000. That would be $17 million today. I had trusts set up for the family, for the church, the city, the high school, and the Sauk County Teachers College. Now, one of the first projects undertaken after my death was the construction of the Frida Myers Nishan Memorial Chapel located in Greenwood Cemetery. I also left money to the Sauk County Historical Society, and they could purchase then the Van Orden Mansion in Baraboo. I benefited the Reedsburg Library and Greenwood Cemetery. The Frida Myers Nishan Foundation was established for research that benefits humanity. By sharing my wealth during the Depression, I enriched the lives of many. Now, Edward Nishan, he never remarried. He divided his time between Reedsburg and Tucson, Arizona. He also made donations to the fire department, the Presbyterian Church, the hospital each year. The fund I established for the Reedsburg School District distributes about $50,000 to high school graduates.
Hello there. I am Sarah Fisher Darrow. I was born June 1st, 1764 in New London, Connecticut. My father was an Irish immigrant. He actually jumped a British warship to get over to America. He and my mother lived in New London, Connecticut, where he had a tannery. I am the oldest person buried in this cemetery. No one buried here was born before 1764. Benedict Arnold was a soldier in the American Revolution for the America until he jumped ship and became a traitor. One of the things he is known for is leading the charge to burn New London, Connecticut down. And among the things that burned when they attacked New London was my father's tannery. I lived in New London until around 1786. I was married once, and that didn't last long. Until I married a man named Amarius Darrow in New York. Marius and I moved to a small town in upstate New York called Boonesville. And there, over the course of 14 years, we had 7 children. Now, we lived there and thrived there until Amarius passed in 1824. Of those 7 children, many of them had very adventurous spirits, and they headed west. My son John moved to Ohio. And not long after Amarius passed, I too moved to Ohio, where I spent time living with Amarius. Now, Amarius had many children. One of them was the father of a very famous Darrow named Clarence. If you know your American history, you would recognize the name Clarence Darrow from the Scopes monkey trial. Clarence went to law school in Ohio and eventually ended up in Chicago, where he tried the Scopes trial among many other famous trials. After living with John Jedediah in Ohio for a time, I moved to live with another of my sons here in Wisconsin. My son, there were so many, I can't remember which one. Henry moved to Wisconsin, first living in Walworth County, then eventually moving to this area where he first lived in a very rickety cabin in the township of Delona until the spring came and he and his wife could move to a farm in Winfield Township. So eventually I moved to live with them in Winfield Township. They had 14 children who were mostly married into local families. And there are many descendants of the Darrow family still living in this area. I was one of the first people interred in this cemetery. The 11 who were buried here prior to my passing were actually buried in a cemetery up on Pine Street. When this cemetery was established, their graves were moved here, and then I was the first who was originally buried here. As you can see, I have a beautiful stone, but it hasn't always looked like this. On the back of this stone is the original stone that was put up at my passing. Several years ago, one of the local historians made a video about my life, and that video went out on YouTube, and one of my great-great-great-granddaughters saw the video and felt compelled to send money to Reedsburg to have that stone preserved. So with that money, they were able to put up a new stone, but the old stone is on the back for all time. It's very wind-worn and water-worn, but it's still here as part of the history. I died December 6th, 1856 at the age of 92, which was a rather long life for folks back then.